Hey, everybody! What's the best way to judge a country's economy? By its GDP or gross domestic product? GDP measures the total value of everything a country produces and sells on the market. And changes in GDP over time are often used to help evaluate the health of an economy. Now, GDP is calculated by adding up the value of all goods and services produced in a country during a given period, usually a quarter or a year. This includes everything from cars and computers to haircuts and home cleaning services. All of these things contribute to the overall size of an economy. But why does GDP matter? Well, it can be a useful tool for comparing the economies of different countries. For example, if we look at nominal GDP, which is GDP measured in current prices, the United States has a much larger economy than, say, Belgium. In 2021, the US GDP was about $23 trillion, while Belgium's was about $600 billion. That means that the US economy is roughly 4 times larger than Belgium's. However, GDP can also be a useful tool for evaluating changes in a country's economy over time. For example, if we look at real GDP, which is GDP adjusted for inflation, we can see that the US economy has grown significantly since the end of World War II. In 1945, real GDP was about $2 trillion. Today, it's over $23 trillion. This means that the US economy has grown by more than 10 times since 1945, even though the population has only grown by about 3 times. Of course, GDP isn't the only thing that matters when it comes to a country's economy. Other important factors include income inequality, the balance of trade, and the level of debt. But still, GDP can be a useful metric for comparing economies, both within and between countries. To calculate GDP, we can use one of 3 approaches. We can start with households and track the income they receive from businesses. Or we can start with businesses and track their sales to households. Or we can start with the government and track its spending. Each of these approaches should, in theory, yield the same result. And indeed, when the numbers are all added up, GDP is about $23 trillion. Now, this may seem like a lot of money, and it is, but it's also a somewhat abstract concept. So let's take a closer look at what goes into GDP. The largest component of GDP is consumer spending, which accounts for about 2/3 of the total. This includes all the money that households spend on goods and services. The second largest component is business investment, which accounts for about 1/5 of GDP. This includes spending on things like new factories, new equipment, and new buildings. The remaining 15% or so is made up of government spending and the balance of trade. While GDP can be a useful metric for comparing economies, it's important to remember that it doesn't capture everything. For example, GDP doesn't take into account the distribution of income within a country. In other words, GDP doesn't tell us anything about how rich or poor a country's citizens are. It also doesn't take into account the level of a country's debt. A country with a lot of debt may have a high GDP, but that may not necessarily mean that its economy is doing well. The debt may be unsustainable and the country may eventually default. So what does a high GDP actually mean? Well, it means that a country's economy is growing and that its citizens have a lot of money to spend. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those citizens are any happier. In fact, some studies have found that there's no relationship between GDP and happiness. Once a country's GDP reaches a certain level, people's happiness doesn't increase even if the country gets richer. So why do countries keep trying to grow their economies if it doesn't make their citizens any happier? Well, It's because we tend to think that economic growth will eventually lead to more innovation, better products, and higher quality of life. Of course, that's not always the case, but it is the hope that drives many of the world's governments to pursue policies that encourage economic growth. So, the next time you hear about a country's GDP, remember that it's just a number. It doesn't really tell us anything about the quality of life of the people who live there. Thanks for watching. See you next time.